Hi, I'm C.M. Williams and welcome to part 3 of the Automatics Manual series. This is a video about blurry backgrounds. So in part 2, we touched on frame rate and we touched on shutter speed. And if you haven't seen the first 2 videos, I have them in the description below. And I have the last episode here. If this is your first time watching the ADM series, you are on episode 3, which is fine. You can totally watch it from here. But if you want to see the first 2, again, they are below. So today we're going to go over the final 2 controls in our exposure triangle, and that is your aperture and your ISO. And we'll start with aperture. Aperture is a lens setting that controls how much light is let in via the opening and closing of the lens itself. This mechanism behaves very much like our iris and our pupils. The more open they are, the more light's let in, and the less open they are, or I guess the more closed they are, the less light is let in. And how open or closed the aperture is measured with an F number, better known as your f-stop. Now, what can be confusing is that the smaller the F number is, the more open your aperture actually is. But I do have a nice explanation / analogy for you that will help you not confuse the two. And I want you to see how something else actually happens when you open or close your iris. It directly correlates with what's called the depth of field. And you may even hear someone refer to it as bokeh. It's the blur happening around your subject. The smaller the F number is, the more blur that you get around your subject, as well as more light. So with that said, the smaller the number, the less that I can put into focus. The larger the number, the more that's in focus. So think of f-stop like this. If your lens can go up to 22 stops, which is about the standard, that's 22 Fs, and I'll show you in this diagram. So imagine that in front of your lens, there are 22 Fs that you can see in a row. And if I put the camera on f4, out of those 22 Fs, I can only put 4 of them in focus. And there's a few scenarios where you may either want something in clear, crisp focus where they're the only thing you can see and everything else is blurry. And then there are scenarios where you do actually want to see some of your background. Say for instance, if you only want to focus on someone's emotion, or you want people to really only pay attention to what a certain person is saying, or if you do actually want to show off both the subject and the scenery, then yeah, you put everything in focus. Yeah, not only do those crushed backgrounds kind of make a more cinematic, professional looking image, it is done purposely to make you only pay attention to the person that's on camera. And then one nice tip is that whenever I'm shooting on a solid background, let's say a solid white, solid black, or even like a solid green screen background, sometimes those backgrounds have marks, wrinkles, they're dirty, what have you. So what I'll do is actually scoop the subject up and make the background blurry. Even the solid background I make blurry, because now all the little marks and wrinkles, you will never know they're there. And the range that you can use your f-stop does correlate with the amount of light you have available to you. The more light you have available to you, the more versatile this control becomes. Because when you have very little light available, you basically have to open it all the way up, and you're kind of forced to just go with whatever your camera lens is able to get you. You may actually want to reveal your background and show what's going on around your subject. You crank the f-stop number up. Now, you will notice a decrease in light. But then, of course, you don't want to go touching your shutter speed if you have it set on 1/50. So if you've been listening closely, you might be asking, but CM, what if I turn on my F number, I lose light, and yeah, I have my camera set to 150 and I don't want to compromise that? Well then, we'll go into our next setting, which is our ISO, and that's your light sensitivity setting. So ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and they literally make standard measurements. So in your camera's case, it's going to be the standard for brightness. ISO on your camera is displayed with numbers like 100, 200, 400, 800. And I will put my phone on silent. Use a low ISO when you have an abundance of light. Let's say like the sun, or if you're in a studio where you can control your light, you're in a controlled environment. And use a high ISO when there's very little light available to you. Let's say a live event where the stage is dim. But when you start to go too high in ISO, there's a bit of a consequence. So With your cameras, with some cameras, ISO can go pretty high, but depending on your camera's actual low light capability, depends on how high you can go before your camera sensor starts to literally have to work too hard to get your camera light, and that's when you start to see that noise and grain in your footage. So yes, some cameras have better low light capabilities than others. The Sony Alpha series, for instance, super boss cameras when it comes to low light. So check with your own camera, test your own camera's ISO settings to see how far you can push it before you start to pretty much lose quality in your footage. The goal here is to try to keep your ISO as low as you can, to try to keep all the crispness you can in your footage, to fight against the grain and noise that might happen when your ISO is set too high. So to wrap this up, ISO is simply a dim or brightness slider for your footage. It's the only setting that only affects brightness, only affects exposure, unlike your shutter speed that affects motion and your aperture that affects depth of field or blurry backgrounds. All right, so that's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, comment with any questions, of course, and then check back next week where we're going to talk about how to select your lenses. Peace.